To say that Julius Caesar's financial situation during his ascent to absolute power was precarious would be putting it mildly. But at times it can get a little bit confusing to try and remember which debts came when, who was bailing out whom, and roughly how long it took Caesar to transform crushing obligations into an empire. It also needs to be stressed that Caesar's debts weren't just one big lump sum that appeared overnight. Different phases of his career generated different categories of debt, each requiring different solutions to fix. Now, I'd also point out at this stage before you start furiously typing that yes, other Roman politicians were also in debt. The entire Roman political class was drowning in obligations. But for the moment, we're going to concentrate on what made Caesar's approach fundamentally different. Unlike his contemporaries who borrowed to survive, Caesar borrowed to dominate. So let's take a look at each phase of his debt-fueled rise in chronological order. For a bit of background, the Rome that Caesar entered was a bit of an odd beast in the grand scheme of things. The Roman Republic had started its journey with debt as a relatively minor political issue, something that cropped up during wars or famines. But by the 1st century BC, debt had metastasized into the central organizing principle of Roman politics. The last 100 years of the Republic were dominated by a handful of ultra-wealthy aristocratic families ruthlessly competing for office. And competing was expensive. Bribery of voters, electors, and jurors was commonplace to the point where it wasn't even really considered corruption anymore, just the cost of doing business. Aspiring politicians would borrow enormous sums to finance their campaigns, then exploit their offices to recoup losses and enrich themselves further. The problem was that the system had multiple failure points that all ended up masking each other. First, the gulf between rich and poor had grown so extreme that most citizens couldn't afford basic necessities without going into debt. Second, the concentration of wealth at the top meant there was a perpetual shortage of cash in circulation, which made interest rates spike. Third, the Senate's paralysis meant that any attempt at reform was immediately filibustered by whichever faction stood to lose. These three categories tended to reinforce each other in unpleasant ways. When citizens fell into debt, they became dependent on wealthy patrons. When patrons gained more clients, they gained more political power. When they gained more political power, they could block reforms that might threaten their position. And round it went. Now, to properly understand how broken the system was, we need some actual numbers. In 86 BC, during the consulships of Cinna and Marius, Rome passed a law that wiped out 75% of all private debts. 75%. That's not a debt relief program. That's a controlled demolition of the financial system. And it still wasn't enough. Less than 2 decades later, Catiline campaigned for consul on a platform of total debt forgiveness, what the Romans called tabulae novae, new accounts. His defeat and subsequent failed coup attempt made it clear that while many Romans wanted debt relief, the people with actual power were not going to allow it. This was the world Caesar grew up in, a world where debt was a weapon, currency, and a chain all at once. According to ancient historian Plutarch, before Caesar even assumed the role of quaestor in 69 BC, he had already accumulated debts totaling 1,300 talents. Now, for those of you not intimately familiar with ancient monetary systems, a talent was about 26 kilograms of silver. So 1,300 talents comes out to roughly 34,000 kilograms of silver, or about 27.5 million sesterces if we're using the more common Roman denomination. To put this in perspective, a Roman legionary earned about 900 sesterces per year at this time. Caesar's early debt was equivalent to roughly 30,000 years of a soldier's wages. Or to put it another way, you could fund an army of 110,000 men for an entire year with that amount, and Caesar had burned through it before he'd even properly started his political career. Now, where did all this money go? Well, Plutarch doesn't give us an itemized receipt, which is frankly quite annoying for historians. But we can make some educated guesses based on what we know about Roman aristocratic life and Caesar's specific circumstances. First, there was his personal presentation. Roman attire was far from the simple white sheets you see in Hollywood movies. The toga, symbol of Roman citizenship, varied dramatically in prestige based on the fineness of its wool. The whiter and softer the fabric, the more expensive. And beneath the toga, the tunic offered opportunities for subtle displays of wealth through embroidered cuffs, gold belt buckles, and richly dyed cloaks. Purple dye, extracted from murex shellfish at a rate of 15,000 snails per garment, cost more than its weight in gold. Caesar's wardrobe was carefully calculated to project patrician refinement while avoiding the ostentatious vulgarity of nouveau riche types like Crassus. Second, Caesar's debt stemmed from his role as a patron. Elite Roman society operated on a clientage system where wealthy patrons supported less wealthy clients in exchange for political support. You hosted dinners for your allies. You provided financial backing for their business ventures. You paid dowries for their daughters. You funded their lawsuits. Failure to meet these obligations meant social death. And Caesar's family, while prestigious, wasn't particularly wealthy. His father had been praetor and governor of Asia, respectable but not spectacular. This meant Caesar had to borrow heavily just to maintain the social position his birth entitled him to. Third, and perhaps most notoriously, Caesar spent lavishly on women. Unlike many of his contemporaries who pursued affairs for political advantage or family connections, Caesar seems to have genuinely enjoyed female company and wasn't shy about spending money on them. Ancient sources mention gifts of jewels, fine cloth, and exotic luxuries. Later enemies would mock him for his affairs, but in his youth, this reputation probably helped more than it hurt. Romans respected a man who lived well and spent freely. And fourth, there was the pirate incident. Now this one is worth examining in detail because it perfectly encapsulates Caesar's attitude toward debt and personal dignity. In 75 BC, while traveling to Rhodes to study oratory, Caesar was captured by Cilician pirates. These weren't some ragtag band of coastal raiders. They were a sophisticated maritime force that effectively controlled large swaths of the Mediterranean. The pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents, roughly 500 kilograms of silver or 500,000 sesterces. Caesar's response was to laugh in their faces. 20 talents? For him? The man who claimed descent from Venus herself through Aeneas and the legendary kings of Alba Longa? Preposterous. He insisted they raise the ransom to 50 talents because anything less was an insult to his dignity. Now, you might think this was just Caesar being an arrogant young aristocrat, and you'd be partly right. But there was method to the madness. By insisting on a higher ransom, Caesar was making a statement about his value and his confidence in his ability to raise the money. He was also, in a very real sense, negotiating the price of his own dignity. If the pirates had accepted 20 talents, it would have established that as Caesar's worth in the eyes of the world. By forcing them to demand 50, he controlled the narrative. During his 38 days of captivity, Caesar behaved like the pirates were his subordinates rather than his captors. He demanded silence when he wanted to sleep. He forced them to listen to his poems and speeches, berating them as illiterates if they didn't show sufficient appreciation. He exercised with them, but always as if he were the commander. And he repeatedly told them, quite cheerfully, that he would hunt them down and have them all crucified once he was free. The pirates thought it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. Once the ransom was paid and Caesar was released, he immediately raised a fleet, hunted down the pirates who were still at the same island, captured them, recovered his 50 talents plus all their possessions, and had them crucified exactly as he'd promised. Though he did have their throats cut first as an act of mercy, which tells you something about Caesar's sense of proportionality. The point of this story isn't just that Caesar was bold or vengeful. It's that even in captivity, even when he was technically powerless, Caesar maintained the psychology of dominance. This would become a pattern throughout his career. By 65 BC, Caesar's debts had grown even larger. He was elected aedile, a magistracy responsible for public works, games, and Rome's grain supply. This was traditionally an office where ambitious politicians bankrupted themselves to gain popularity. Caesar took this tradition and cranked it up to 11. He organized gladiatorial games featuring 320 pairs of fighters, more than had ever fought in a single event. Only new Senate laws limiting gladiator numbers prevented him from fielding even more. He restored the Appian Way at his own expense, meaning at his creditors' expense. He put on elaborate beast hunts. He decorated public spaces with temporary structures that were spectacular enough to be mentioned decades later. The total cost probably approached 20 million sesterces. Caesar didn't have 20 million sesterces. He borrowed it. And here's where the system gets interesting. Because Caesar wasn't just borrowing from one source. He was creating a network of overlapping obligations that made it almost impossible to untangle who owed what to whom. Then came 63 BC and perhaps the most audacious gamble of his early career. Caesar stood for election as Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. This wasn't just another magistracy. The Pontifex Maximus controlled the religious calendar, could declare omens favorable or unfavorable, and held the position for life. It was the highest religious office in the Republic and carried immense prestige and practical political power. Caesar was competing against two ex-consuls, men far more senior and distinguished. His chances appeared slim. On the morning of the election, Caesar told his mother as she kissed him goodbye that he would return as Pontifex Maximus or he would not return at all. He wasn't being poetic. His debts had grown so massive that electoral defeat would mean exile or worse. The bribery must have been spectacular. We don't know exactly how much Caesar spent, but it was enough to overcome a significant disadvantage in prestige and seniority. He won. And suddenly Caesar was Pontifex Maximus, a position he would hold for the rest of his life, giving him leverage over the political calendar and religious legitimacy that would prove invaluable later. But that victory didn't end his debt worries. Far from it. Caesar's obligations by this point probably exceeded 40 million sesterces. That's more than the annual revenue of several Roman provinces. And unlike some politicians who went into debt reactively, scrambling to keep up, Caesar seemed to be borrowing strategically, building a network of creditors who all had a vested interest in his continued success. This brings us to Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose fortune and greed were legendary. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, possibly one of the wealthiest individuals in human history. His fortune came from multiple streams. Some from buying up proscribed estates during Sulla's dictatorship at bargain prices. Some from silver mines. But his most famous or infamous revenue stream was his private fire brigade. Rome lacked anything like a modern fire service. So Crassus would dispatch his firefighters to any major fire, but they would refuse to put out the flames until the property owner agreed to sell to Crassus at whatever price he named. As the fire raged and neighboring buildings caught, panic would set in. Crassus would calmly negotiate, naming rock-bottom prices. Once he owned the property, his men would spring into action. He'd then rebuild using his own enslaved workers and sell or rent at enormous profits. Now, Crassus didn't loan money out of kindness. He was building his own political network of obligated politicians. And Caesar, with his massive debts and obvious talent, was exactly the sort of investment Crassus wanted to make. The only problem was that Caesar's debts had grown so large that even Crassus hesitated. In 62 BC, Caesar was elected praetor. After his term ended, he was assigned the province of Hispania Ulteria, roughly modern Andalusia in Spain. This was Caesar's chance to get rich. Provincial governorships offered multiple revenue streams: official salaries, gifts from locals seeking favorable treatment, military plunder if you could engineer war, and various semi-legal methods of extraction. But before Caesar could leave for Spain, his creditors literally blockaded him at the gates of Rome. He couldn't leave without settling at least some of his debts. And he couldn't settle his debts without going to Spain to make money. Classic catch-22. This is when Crassus stepped in with a loan of 830 talents, about 17,500 kilograms of silver. This was an immense sum, roughly 1/8 of Crassus's entire fortune. In modern terms, it's comparable to a billionaire lending out $500 million to a single politician. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential payoff. In modern terms, it's comparable to a billionaire lending out $500 million to a single politician. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential payoff. Caesar used the money to satisfy his most pressing creditors, then rushed off to Spain. And in Spain, Caesar finally struck gold. Literally. He conducted lightning campaigns against the Lusitani and Calaisi tribes in northwestern Iberia, captured towns, seized plunder, and brought Roman troops to the Atlantic Ocean for the first time. He claimed to have completed the conquest of the entire peninsula, which was a considerable exaggeration but made for good propaganda. More importantly, he looted enough silver and enslaved enough prisoners to finally pay off at least some of his debts. Caesar returned to Rome in 60 BC, with money in his coffers, a military reputation, and a demand for a triumph, the highest honor Rome could grant a victorious general. But Caesar had a problem. Roman law required that to campaign for consul, you had to declare your candidacy in person inside the city. But to celebrate a triumph, you had to remain outside the city with your military imperium intact. You couldn't do both. Caesar asked the Senate for a special exemption, allowing him to declare his candidacy in absentia. The request was reasonable and had precedent. The Senate seemed inclined to grant it. Then Cato the Younger, Caesar's enemy, stood up and filibustered. He literally talked for the entire day until the Senate session had to adjourn. And that was that. No exemption. Faced with the choice between a triumph and the consulship, Caesar chose the consulship. The triumph was glory. The consulship was power. And power could eventually buy all the glory anyone could want. Caesar's consulship was going to be expensive. Bribing enough voters to overcome the Senate's opposition would require enormous sums. Running the consul's office while pushing through controversial legislation would cost even more. Caesar needed money and muscle. He had Crassus for the money, but he needed something else: popular support and military backing. Enter Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Pompey was Rome's greatest living general. He defeated pirates, conquered the East, and reorganized half the Mediterranean under Roman control. He'd recently returned from his eastern campaigns expecting to be showered with honors. Instead, the Senate, led by Cato and the conservative faction, had blocked all his requests. They refused to ratify his eastern settlements. They refused to grant land to his veterans. For 3 years running, they'd stymied him at every turn. Pompey was angry, frustrated, and politically isolated. His soldiers were equally frustrated. They'd conquered an empire and expected to be rewarded with land grants so they could retire. Instead, they were left hanging while the Senate played political games. In 60 BC, Caesar brought Crassus and Pompey together in a secret meeting. This wasn't easy. Crassus and Pompey despised each other. During the Spartacus revolt years earlier, Crassus had finally defeated the slave army after a long, grinding campaign. Then Pompey swooped in at the last moment, mopped up stragglers, and claimed much of the glory. Crassus never forgave him. Both men had refused to disband their armies afterward, and in 70 BC they'd become consuls together in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and barely concealed hatred. But Caesar managed to convince them that cooperation was in everyone's interest. The arrangement was simple. If Caesar became consul, he would push through legislation giving Pompey his land grants and ratification, and giving Crassus his tax concessions. In return, Crassus would provide the money for bribes, and Pompey would provide implicit military backing and the votes of his veterans. To cement the alliance, Caesar married his only daughter, Julia, to Pompey. Despite the enormous age gap, Pompey was 48 and Julia was in her late teens or early 20s, the marriage appears to have been genuinely happy. Julia became the emotional glue holding the alliance together. This combination, misleadingly called the First Triumvirate by later historians, was politically invincible. Crassus had the wealth, Pompey had the military prestige and veteran votes. Caesar had the legal authority and religious position. Together, they controlled Rome. With the backing of Pompey and Crassus, Caesar was elected consul for 59 BC. The election was spectacularly corrupt, even by Roman standards. Crassus must have spent millions on bribes. But the Senate wasn't going to make Caesar's year easy. They paired him with Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus as co-consul, a man who could be counted on to obstruct everything. Caesar's first major initiative was an agrarian bill to purchase land from willing sellers and distribute it to Pompey's veterans and Rome's urban poor. He presented the bill to the Senate first, hoping to show that he was willing to work within the system. This was actually quite clever. If the Senate approved the bill, Caesar looked like a statesman. If they rejected it, he had justification for going directly to the People's Assembly. The Senate, predictably, rejected it. Not on substantive grounds, just on principle. Cato and his allies mounted fierce opposition. When Bibulus was asked his opinion, he simply said it would not pass even if everyone else wanted it. At that point, Caesar revealed the existence of the First Triumvirate publicly. Both Pompey and Crassus voiced their support for the measure. Caesar then took the bill directly to the People's Assembly. The Senate conservatives made their last stand physically, trying to block the vote through force and religious obstruction. Bibulus declared bad omens. Cato tried to filibuster again. When that failed, they attempted to disrupt the actual voting. Caesar had no scruples about countering legal obstruction with open force. During the voting in the Forum, Bibulus was physically assaulted. A bucket of excrement was dumped over his head. The fasces, symbols of consular authority, were broken. Bibulus retreated to his home and spent the rest of his consulship issuing proclamations of bad omens from a safe distance. Since Bibulus never personally observed these omens in public, they had no legal effect. The year of the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus was often referred to jokingly as the year of Julius and Caesar, reflecting Caesar's complete dominance. He was both consuls at once. Caesar secured passage of the agrarian law. He passed legislation ratifying Pompey's eastern settlements. He brought tax proposals before the assembly that dramatically benefited Crassus's equestrian business interests. One particularly brazen move involved the tax farming industry, which was collapsing. Tax farmers were private contractors who bid on tax collection contracts and kept any surplus. By 59 BC, they were on the brink of bankruptcy. Caesar forgave as much as 1/3 of their debt to the state treasury. This was an enormous bailout of a politically connected industry. The kicker? Both Caesar and Crassus had heavily invested in the struggling tax farming sector. It was one of history's earliest examples of a government bailout of politically connected financial interests. Additional laws aimed at curbing corruption were passed, making provincial governors more accountable, though these would later be used against Caesar himself. While the First Triumvirate was technically legal, and taking bills before the people rather than the Senate had precedent, the methods Caesar employed shocked even jaded Romans. At the end of his consulship, Caesar secured for himself something unprecedented. Through a vote of the People's Assembly, he was awarded a 5-year command in Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum. The Senate itself, on Pompey's motion, extended this to include Transalpine Gaul. 3 provinces, 4 legions, 5 years. This was an enormous military command. It was also an enormous financial opportunity, and critically, as long as Caesar held military command, he was immune from prosecution. His enemies in the Senate had a long list of illegal actions from his consulship they wanted to charge him with, but they couldn't touch him while he commanded an army. Now, before Caesar left for Gaul, there was one more bit of business to attend to. In 58 BC, Publius Clodius served as tribune and defended Caesar's interests. Cicero, who had refused to join the first triumvirate and had made himself an enemy of Clodius, was driven into exile on charges of having unlawfully executed citizens during the Catiline conspiracy. Cato was sent to Cyprus to annex the island, effectively removing both of Caesar's most eloquent opponents from Rome. The stage was now set for the final act. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul lasted 8 years and transformed him from a debt-ridden politician into one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Rome. But the wars weren't just about money. They were about survival. Without military success and the plunder it brought, Caesar couldn't pay his debts. Without paying his debts, he couldn't maintain his political networks. Without his political networks, he would face prosecution the moment his imperium ended. The war began in 58 BC, when the Helvetii, a confederation of Celtic tribes from modern Switzerland, attempted to migrate through Roman territory. Caesar used this as justification to raise his legions and march. He defeated the Helvetii at Bibracte and sent them back home. Then he turned on Ariovistus, a Germanic king who controlled parts of eastern Gaul. Despite Ariovistus being technically a Roman ally, Caesar issued an ultimatum: stay east of the Rhine or face war. Ariovistus chose war. Caesar crushed him. Over the next 8 years, Caesar systematically conquered all of Gaul. He fought the Belgae in the north. He launched expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BC. When the Gallic tribes united under Vercingetorix in 52 BC, Caesar defeated them at the climactic siege of Alesia. Now, Alesia deserves special attention because it perfectly demonstrates Caesar's military genius and the brutal economics of Roman warfare. Vercingetorix, a charismatic young nobleman, had united the Gallic tribes in a final desperate rebellion. After some initial success, including a victory at Gergovia that nearly drove Caesar from Gaul, Vercingetorix retreated to Alesia, an oppidum or fortified town on a hill with rivers on either side. Caesar decided on a siege. He ordered his men to build a line of fortifications, a circumvallation, completely encircling Alesia. 11 Roman miles of walls, trenches, towers, and traps. Then, knowing that Vercingetorix would call for a relief army, Caesar ordered his men to build a second line of fortifications facing outward, a contravallation to defend against relievers. In total, about 40 kilometers of fortifications built in roughly 4 to 5 weeks. The Gallic relief army arrived with perhaps 250,000 men. Together with Vercingetorix's forces inside Alesia, the Romans were outnumbered perhaps 4 or 5 to 1. The battle came down to one desperate day, when Gallic forces attacked from both sides simultaneously. Caesar, wearing his distinctive red cloak so his men could see him, personally led reserves to plug gaps in the line. The Romans held, the Gauls broke, Vercingetorix surrendered. About 70,000 Gauls were captured and sold into slavery. The plunder was immense, and Caesar's reputation was secured. He was now one of Rome's greatest generals, comparable to Pompey or the legendary commanders of old. But what really matters for our purposes is the financial side. The slave trade alone from the Gallic Wars must have generated tens of millions of sesterces. Add in plunder from sacked towns, tribute payments from conquered tribes, and personal gifts from grateful local rulers, and Caesar was drowning in money. By Caesar's own probably exaggerated account, he killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more. The economic impact was staggering. Caesar used this wealth to build a political machine in Rome. He funded the careers of younger politicians. He paid for massive building projects, including the Forum Iulium in central Rome, which cost 100 million sesterces. He enriched his officers. He gave lavish bonuses to his soldiers. By the end of the Gallic Wars, Caesar commanded 8 legions of battle-hardened veterans who were personally loyal to him, not to Rome. They owed him their fortunes, and they would follow him anywhere. By 56 BC, cracks were appearing in the first triumvirate. Pompey and Crassus were drifting back into rivalry. Cicero, recalled from exile through Pompey's influence, immediately tried to break up the alliance. Just when it seemed Pompey might defect to the Senate, the 3 men met at Lucca in northern Italy and renewed their compact. Caesar would get another 5 years in Gaul. Pompey and Crassus would share the consulship for 55 BC and then receive their own military commands. Pompey got Spain, though he governed through legates while staying in Rome. Crassus got what he'd always wanted, his own war to win glory comparable to Pompey and Caesar. Crassus chose to invade Parthia, Rome's great rival empire beyond the Euphrates. It was a disaster. In 53 BC, at the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians annihilated Crassus's army. Crassus was killed and beheaded. His head was later used as a prop in a theatrical performance of Euripides' Bacchae for the Parthian king's entertainment. The death of Crassus destroyed the balance. With the money man gone, only Caesar and Pompey remained, and they were now rivals. The relationship deteriorated rapidly when Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth in 54 BC. Without her moderating influence, the 2 men began circling each other like gladiators. The Senate, which had been watching for any opportunity, now moved decisively against Caesar. They demanded he give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen before the end of 49 BC. This would leave him vulnerable to prosecution. Pompey, showing characteristic vacillation and duplicity, eventually sided with the Senate. Caesar was trapped. If he gave up his command, he would be prosecuted and destroyed. Everything he'd built, all the debts he'd paid, all the networks he'd constructed would collapse. But if he refused, he would be declared a public enemy. His only option was to march on Rome. In January 49 BC, when the Senate issued its ultimatum and 2 tribunes friendly to Caesar had to flee for their lives, Caesar made his decision. He crossed the Rubicon River with 1 legion. According to tradition, he said, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. It was a gambling metaphor, which was appropriate. Caesar had been gambling with borrowed money his entire career. This was just his biggest bet yet. Caesar's march down Italy was spectacularly successful. Pompey and most of the Senate fled to Greece without fighting a major battle. Caesar captured Rome within 60 days. Many of Pompey's supposed supporters simply switched sides when confronted with Caesar's legions. Some did it for political calculation. Some did it because they'd been part of Caesar's network of debtors and patrons all along. By the time Caesar defeated Pompey at Pharsalus in 48 BC and had himself declared dictator, he had accumulated as much as 40 million sesterces in personal debt from the civil war costs. Yet even this crushing obligation, he turned to his advantage. Caesar returned to Rome in 47 BC to find the city in chaos. Citizens were suffering terribly under massive debt. Mark Antony, left as Caesar's master of horse to govern Rome in his absence, had done little to ease the crisis. The population was on the brink of violence. 2 tribunes had already pushed for total debt cancellation. The Senate had declared a state of emergency both times. The problem was that total cancellation would cause economic catastrophe. Many people who thought of themselves as poor were actually creditors to people even poorer. Wiping out all debt would wipe out their assets. Plus, Caesar himself was one of the largest borrowers. Total cancellation would help him personally, which made it politically impossible. Caesar's solution was ingenious. He decreed that debtors should satisfy their creditors according to a valuation of their possessions at the price which they had paid for them before the Civil War, deducting whatever interest already had been paid. Since property values had risen steeply during the war, this arrangement wiped out about 1/4 of all debts. This was brilliant political calculation. It provided enough relief to satisfy most debtors and prevent revolution. It didn't help Caesar excessively, so he couldn't be accused of self-dealing. And by forcing valuations at pre-war prices, it actually punished speculators who'd bought property cheap during the chaos and expected to profit. Properties seized from dead enemies, such as Pompey's vast estates, were put up for auction. Caesar didn't proscribe living enemies as Sulla had done, but there were plenty of properties from those killed in the war. The sales provided enormous relief, while also enriching the treasury. Even Antony, who'd fallen from Caesar's favor, was forced to pay full price for Pompey's former estates. As dictator, Caesar embarked on a reform program that would reshape Rome. He enlarged the Senate from 600 to 900 members, packing it with his supporters. He increased the number of magistrates, creating more positions to reward loyalty. He reformed the calendar, adding 4 extra months to 46 BC to realign it with the solar year and creating what we still call the Julian calendar. Caesar established a more equitable tax system. He cut the welfare rolls in half through land distributions and stricter eligibility requirements. He founded colonies throughout the empire, settling over 100,000 families on their own farms. These weren't just soldiers. Many were urban poor who'd been living hand-to-mouth in Rome's slums. Caesar gave them the means to escape debt and poverty. His most important policy was his lavish granting of citizenship. Those subjected by Rome could now receive full citizenship rights and a share in empire's benefits. The Italian allies had received citizenship during the Social War. Caesar extended the privilege to Gauls along the Po River, and later to some Gauls he'd conquered himself. This created new Romans who owed their status entirely to Caesar. The Forum Iulium, Caesar's grand building project, employed thousands of workers and craftsmen. It wasn't just a monument to his ego, it was a massive stimulus program. All these programs were funded by Gallic plunder, Egyptian tribute, and confiscated property from defeated enemies. Caesar took wealth from conquered peoples and dead opponents and redistributed it to his supporters. The cost of all this was that the Roman people gave up their political freedom. And remarkably, most Romans were glad to be rid of it. They wanted to be free to live as individuals, pursue their own careers, and not be bothered by the constant wrangling of politicians. The debt crisis that had paralyzed Rome for generations was finally solved, not through republican deliberation, but through the autocratic action of a single man. A number of symbolic honors were heaped upon Caesar. His portrait appeared on coins, something never done for a living person before. He was granted the title Pater Patriae, father of his country. The month of Quintilis was renamed Julius, which is why we call it July today. He was given a golden chair in the Senate and the right to wear triumphal regalia at all public functions. Caesar was even offered the title of king, though he refused it publicly. The Romans had expelled their kings 500 years earlier, and the word rex carried connotations of tyranny. But whether he was called king or dictator, the substance was the same. He held absolute control over Rome and its empire. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius assassinated Caesar in the theater of Pompeii. They believed they were saving the Republic from a tyrant. They fatally misunderstood the situation. The Republic they wanted to save no longer existed, if it ever had. Caesar's assassination didn't restore the Republic. Instead, it triggered another 13 years of civil war. Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, Octavian, eventually emerged victorious. Taking the name Augustus, he became Rome's first emperor, completing the transformation Caesar had begun. Interestingly, one of Augustus's first acts was dealing with the debt crisis that still plagued Rome. He took a different approach than Caesar, using the wealth of Egypt, which he'd conquered, to inject massive capital into the Roman economy. He also instituted reforms that made credit more readily available and interest rates more reasonable. These measures stabilized the economy and ushered in 2 centuries of prosperity. But the fundamental lesson of Caesar's rise remained. In a republic where money was power and power was money, whoever controlled the flow of debt controlled everything. Now, to properly understand Caesar's genius, we need to examine the actual mechanics of Roman lending. This wasn't like modern banking with credit cards and mortgage companies. Roman finance operated on fundamentally different principles. First, there were no banks in the modern sense. Instead, there were argentari, money changers who operated stalls in the forum and other public spaces. These men would exchange currencies, store deposits, and occasionally make loans, but they were relatively small operators. For large loans of the sort Caesar required, you needed wealthy individuals like Crassus. Interest rates in Rome varied wildly. The legal maximum was set at 12% per annum, but this was frequently exceeded, especially for risky loans. During times of crisis, rates could spike to 48% or higher. When Caesar borrowed money for his political campaigns, he was almost certainly paying somewhere between 15 and 25%, depending on the creditor's assessment of his chances. Loans were typically secured by property, either land or slaves. A creditor who wasn't repaid could seize the collateral and sell it to recover his investment. This created a vicious cycle. If you borrowed to fund a campaign and lost, you lost your property as well. If you won but couldn't convert your office into sufficient profit, you'd still lose everything. This is why provincial governorships were so valuable. A province gave you multiple revenue streams. First, official salaries and expenses, which could be padded significantly. Second, gifts from local rulers and wealthy provincials seeking favorable treatment. Third, the possibility of military action, which meant plunder and slaves. Fourth, various semi-legal methods of extraction that were technically forbidden but universally practiced. What made Caesar different was that he borrowed not just to fund his own campaigns, but to fund others' campaigns. He lent money to promising young politicians, creating a network of debtors who owed him their careers. When he had money, he was extraordinarily generous with it, hosting lavish banquets and giving fortunes to friends and allies. This generosity served multiple purposes. It made him popular with the masses, who saw him as a patron willing to help ordinary Romans. It created obligations among the elite, who were in his debt literally and figuratively, and it established his reputation as a man whose word was good and whose promises would be kept. The flip side was that Caesar's creditors, particularly Crassus, had enormous leverage over him. If they called in their loans, he would be ruined. But Caesar was skillful at managing these relationships, always paying just enough to keep creditors satisfied while never fully freeing himself from obligation. Because once you were free of debt, you were free to be abandoned by your former creditors. Staying in debt, at least partially, kept them invested in your success. What do we make of Caesar's debt-fueled rise to power? The historical record is clear on the basic facts. Caesar borrowed more than any Roman before him. He used that borrowed money to build networks of obligation that eventually conquered Rome. He transformed debt from a liability into a weapon of political warfare. But the larger implications are more complex. Caesar exploited a broken system to accumulate personal power on an unprecedented scale. He used debt strategically in ways that transformed it from a burden into an asset. He borrowed his way to supreme power, and in doing so, he demonstrated that in a sufficiently corrupt system, debt could be more powerful than law, money more persuasive than principle, and obligation more binding than citizenship. The question isn't really whether Caesar was uniquely ambitious or ruthless. Plenty of Romans were ambitious and ruthless. The question is why the system was vulnerable to this particular strategy. And the answer is that the Roman Republic of the 1st century BC had become a society where formal legal authority mattered less than informal networks of obligation, where the gap between rich and poor had grown so extreme that the middle class was disappearing, and where political paralysis made reform impossible. Caesar didn't create these conditions. He exploited them. If it hadn't been Caesar, it would have been someone else. The Republic was already dying from internal contradictions. Caesar just happened to be the man holding the knife when it finally collapsed. In the end, Caesar transformed Roman debts from a private problem into a political weapon, from an economic issue into a constitutional crisis, and from a crisis into an empire. He started with nothing but aristocratic lineage and crushing debts. He ended as dictator of Rome, master of an empire stretching from Spain to Syria, from Britain to Africa. The Roman Republic died many deaths. It died with the Gracchi's reforms. It died in Sulla's proscriptions. It died at Pharsalus. It died on the Ides of March. But perhaps its true death came earlier and quieter, in the moment when men like Caesar realized that borrowed money could buy anything, even Rome itself. And that's the story of how Julius Caesar used debt to finance his rise to power. Of course, when we get to covering Augustus and the establishment of the empire, you'll hear even more about how Caesar's financial strategies were refined and systematized. But that's for another time.